Maya Carter had been working at Astor's Diner, a small but elegant eatery nestled in the heart of New York City, for nearly 7 years, barely making enough to cover rent and keep up with her student loans. She had grown accustomed to the bustling sounds of the kitchen, the chatter of customers, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee that clung to her apron by the end of every shift. Life had never been kind to her, but she had learned to endure its cruelty with quiet resilience. Raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to keep a roof over their heads, Maya knew what it meant to struggle. Every morning, she dragged herself out of bed in her tiny Brooklyn apartment, working double shifts, serving customers with a tired yet polite smile, and dreaming of a better future. Among the many regulars who frequented the diner, one man stood out. William Astor III, an elderly billionaire known for his vast wealth, real estate empire, and philanthropic work. Unlike most of the wealthy patrons who came in with their arrogance and entitlement, Mr. Astor was different. He never treated her like a mere waitress, never snapped his fingers to get her attention, and never failed to leave a generous tip. He was a quiet man, always dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, sitting at the same corner booth, reading the New York Times while sipping his black coffee. Over the years, they had developed an unlikely friendship, one built on genuine conversations rather than transactions. He often asked about her dreams, her ambitions, and the struggles of everyday people. Maya, though cautious at first, found herself opening up to him about her past, her aspirations of going back to college, and the harsh realities of life as a black woman in a world where success always seemed just out of reach. Their conversations were never forced. There was something about Mr. Astor that felt almost fatherly, as if he truly cared about the fate of the people society had abandoned. But then, one cold January morning, everything changed. The diner was unusually quiet when Maya arrived for her shift, the air thick with an unsettling tension she couldn't quite place. She was tying her apron when her manager, Linda, rushed in, eyes wide with something between disbelief and shock. "Did you hear the news?" Linda gasped. "Mr. Astor is dead." Maya froze, her hands gripping the counter as the words settled in. It felt unreal. Just 2 nights ago, he had been sitting in his usual spot, smiling at her as she refilled his coffee, leaving behind a $50 tip like he always did. "How?" she asked, barely able to keep her voice steady. "Heart attack," Linda whispered. "It was all over the news this morning." Maya swallowed the lump in her throat. A strange sadness settled in her chest, heavier than she expected. Though she had only known him through the walls of the diner, his presence had been a comforting constant in her life. She felt a deep loss, as if the world had suddenly lost one of its few remaining good souls. The day went by in a blur, customers murmuring about Mr. Astor's passing, news anchors flashing his photo on television screens, recounting his legacy, fortune, and powerful connections. But nothing could prepare Maya for what happened next. That evening, just as she was clocking out, 2 men in sleek black suits walked into the diner, their presence immediately commanding attention. "Maya Carter?" one of them asked. She hesitated before nodding. The man reached into his briefcase, pulled out an official-looking envelope, and handed it to her. "You've been named the sole beneficiary of Mr. William Astor III's entire estate." The words didn't make sense. It had to be a mistake, some clerical error, a joke, something. She stared at the envelope as if it might burst into flames, her fingers trembling. I think you have the wrong person," she stammered. The second man, a lawyer from Astor's legal team, shook his head. "There's no mistake, Miss Carter. Mr. Astor's final will clearly states that you are to inherit everything, his estate, his business empire, his assets. The total sum amounts to approximately $8 billion. The entire diner fell silent. A fork clattered onto a plate somewhere in the background. Someone gasped. Linda's jaw practically hit the floor. Maya felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "That can't be right," she whispered. I'm just a waitress." The first lawyer gave her a sympathetic look. Mr. Astor clearly thought otherwise. What followed was pure chaos. The news spread like wildfire, and within hours, Maya's face was plastered across every media outlet. The headline read like something out of a bad movie. "Black waitress inherits billions from mysterious business tycoon." Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters camped outside her apartment. Strangers bombarded her social media, some congratulating her, others spewing hate, accusing her of being a gold digger or worse. But the real storm hit when Mr. Astor's family came into the picture. His nephews, distant cousins, and business partners, all of whom had expected to inherit a chunk of his wealth, were furious. They demanded answers, filing legal challenges, accusing her of manipulation, fraud, and even blackmail. The whispers turned into full-blown conspiracy theories. Had she been his secret mistress? Was she blackmailing him? Had she somehow tricked an old man into giving her his fortune? Maya barely had time to breathe before she was summoned to the lawyer's office for the official reading. The conference room was filled with powerful, angry people, men and women in designer suits, their glare sharp enough to cut steel. Maya sat in the middle, feeling like an imposter, her hands clammy, her heart pounding in her chest. At the head of the table, Mr. Astor's personal lawyer, Jonathan Marks, cleared his throat and began to read the will. I, William Astor III, being of sound mind and body, leave my entire estate to Maya Carter, the only person who ever treated me like a human being rather than a bank account. Gasps. Outrage. A woman, one of his distant nieces, let out an actual scream. "This is insane," someone else yelled. But the lawyer continued unfazed. "I have watched Maya work tirelessly for years, facing hardship with grace, never once asking for a handout. Unlike my family, she never sought my wealth, only offered me kindness without expectation. For that, she deserves everything I have to give." The room erupted into chaos. Maya sat frozen, barely able to process the words. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a cruel joke. This was real. The weight of $8 billion had just fallen onto her shoulders, and the world was waiting for her to either rise or crumble under the pressure. Maya Carter left the law office that day, feeling like she had stepped into a reality that didn't belong to her. The moment she walked out, a wall of flashing cameras and shouting reporters swallowed her whole. Microphones were thrust in her face, each journalist desperate for a quote, a reaction, something that could sell headlines. "Maya, did you manipulate Mr. Astor into giving you his fortune? Are you prepared for the legal battle against his family? Do you have any experience managing billions? What will you do with the money?" She couldn't answer any of them. Her heart pounded as she forced her way through the crowd, shielding her face from the blinding flashes, feeling her breath shorten in the suffocating chaos. Before she could even reach the curb, a sleek black SUV pulled up and the door swung open. A voice called out, urgent but familiar, "Get in." Maya didn't think. She just obeyed, slipping into the backseat of the car, gasping for air as the door shut behind her, cutting off the relentless paparazzi. Her pulse was still hammering in her ears when she turned to see Jonathan Marks, Mr. Astor's personal attorney, seated beside her. "You need protection," he said, his expression unreadable. "Your life is about to change in ways you can't imagine." Maya let out a humorless laugh, rubbing her temples. "I think I've imagined plenty already." But Jonathan shook his head. "No, Maya, you're thinking too small. You're not just rich now. You're a billionaire. That comes with enemies, with consequences. You need security, advisors, people who know how to handle this." She swallowed hard, the reality of his words sinking in. Enemies, consequences. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about power. By the time the SUV pulled up in front of an ultra-modern penthouse in Manhattan, Maya felt like she was floating outside of her own body. She barely recognized a woman being escorted past security, stepping into an elevator lined with gold trim, and emerging into a home so massive it looked more like a palace than an apartment. Jonathan handed her a set of keys. "This is yours now," he said simply. "Mr. Astor left it for you. And this is just the beginning. Just the beginning." The word sent a chill down her spine. The next few days were a whirlwind. Lawyers flooded her with legal documents. Financial advisors overwhelmed her with charts and figures she could barely comprehend. And PR strategists discussed how to clean up her public image. The media was painting her as everything from a Cinderella story to a con artist, while Mr. Astor's furious relatives publicly vowed to challenge the will in court. And then there was a social media firestorm. Some people celebrated her, calling it poetic justice that a working-class black woman had inherited the wealth of a man born into privilege. Others hurled insults, accusing her of being a fraud, a nobody who didn't deserve a penny of what she had been given. Amidst the chaos, Maya couldn't help but feel the weight of something even heavier than the money: loneliness. The people she had once considered friends now looked at her differently. Some old co-workers from the diner reached out, but their texts were laced with expectations, hints about loans and business ideas, and sudden emergencies that required financial help. Even Linda, her former boss, who had always treated her like family, suddenly seemed distant, her warmth replaced by an awkward hesitancy, as if Maya had become someone else entirely. And then there were the threats. The first one came in the form of a handwritten letter, slipped under her penthouse door. "Give back what isn't yours before you regret it." The second was an anonymous email. "You don't belong in this world. Walk away before someone forces you out." Maya's hands shook as she read the messages. Someone wanted her gone, but she had no intention of walking away. Her first act as a billionaire was to hire a security team, men in dark suits who now shadowed her wherever she went. But money couldn't protect her from everything. It couldn't protect her from the ugly stares of people who believed she didn't deserve her wealth, from the business elites who refused to take her seriously, or from the court battle that loomed over her like a storm cloud. When she walked into the courtroom for the first hearing, she was met with cold glares from Mr. Astor's family. His nephew, Richard Astor, was leading the charge, his face twisted with fury as he pointed an accusing finger at her. "She manipulated an old man into signing over his fortune," he spat. "This woman is a fraud, and we will prove it." Maya met his gaze, her spine straightening. She had spent her entire life being underestimated, being looked down upon, being told she wasn't good enough. But this time, she wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for the right to exist in a world that had already decided she didn't belong. The trial was brutal. Mr. Astor's family presented fake witnesses, claiming Maya had been cozying up to the billionaire for years, that she had manipulated him, isolated him from his real family. They painted her as a gold digger, a woman who had somehow seduced an elderly man without anyone realizing it. The tabloids ate it up, printing sensationalized headlines that further fueled the public's divided opinion of her. But Maya refused a break. Then came the moment that changed everything. Jonathan Marks, Mr. Astor's lawyer, produced a video recording, one Mr. Astor had made before his death. The courtroom fell silent as his grainy image flickered onto the screen. His voice was weak but steady. "To those who will challenge my will, let me make something clear. I left everything to Maya Carter because she is the only person in my life who ever saw me as a human being, not as a wallet, not as a business opportunity, not as a stepping stone. I have spent my entire life surrounded by parasites, by people who only value me for what I could give them. Maya never asked me for anything, except for how my day was going. She deserves this, and I will not have my wishes questioned. If my so-called family truly cared about me, they would have been there for me while I was alive. Instead, they only appeared when they smelled money." The video ended, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Maya looked across the room at Richard, who had gone pale, his lips pressed into a thin, furious line. The judge sighed and turned to plaintiffs. "Unless you have actual evidence to suggest Mr. Astor was not of sound mind when he made this decision, I see no reason to overturn his will." The case was dismissed. Maya had won, but as she walked out of the courtroom, feeling the heat of the cameras and the whispers of onlookers, she knew this wasn't the end. Money might have given her power, but it had also made her a target. The threats weren't over. The battles weren't over. If she wanted to survive in this new world, she had to stop being just a waitress who got lucky. She had to become something else entirely. The gavel had barely struck before Maya Carter was ushered out of the courtroom by her security team. But the battle was far from over. The world had seen her win, but that didn't mean they had accepted her. The moment she stepped onto the courthouse steps, a roar of questions bombarded her from every direction. "Maya, what's your next move? How does it feel to be a billionaire? Are you worried about retaliation from the Astor family?" The cameras flashed, microphones shoved inches from her face, but this time she didn't shrink away. She didn't stammer, didn't fumble for words. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and met the press with steely confidence. I think Mr. Astor made it clear that his wealth was given to me because I earned his trust, not because I asked for it, she said, her voice calm but firm. I intend to honor that trust by using these resources to help people who've been overlooked just like I was. She didn't wait for their reaction. She simply turned and walked away, leaving them to scramble for their headlines. But the fight wasn't over. Mr. Astor's nephew, Richard, and the rest of his family weren't willing to give up so easily. The courtroom loss had humiliated them, but more importantly, it had cut them off from an empire they had always assumed was theirs. Within days of the ruling, false allegations began popping up in the press. Reports surfaced suggesting Maya had been a former escort, a woman who had been romantically involved with Mr. Astor, despite zero evidence. Other stories claimed she had secretly coerced the billionaire into signing over his fortune, some even speculating that she had helped speed up his death. Maya wasn't just fighting against greedy relatives anymore. She was fighting against an entire system that refused to accept her as a billionaire. The more she tried to keep her head down, the worse the attacks became. Strangers hurled slurs at her online. Business elites refused to meet with her, and people she had once called friends suddenly stopped returning her calls. Even when she donated a portion of her newfound wealth to struggling black-owned businesses, women's shelters, and education programs, she was met with skepticism. She's just trying to clean her image, critics sneered. She doesn't know what she's doing. And maybe at first that was true. For weeks, Maya struggled to adjust to this new world. The numbers thrown at her during business meetings felt like a foreign language. CEOs and investors talked over her, expecting her to sign whatever contracts they placed in front of her. Some tried to take advantage of her lack of experience, pushing her toward bad investments or lucrative deals that only benefited them. But Maya had spent her entire life surviving, and survivors learned quickly she didn't sign the contracts. Instead, she hired her own financial experts, not the ones recommended to her by billionaires with ulterior motives, but independent professionals who had no ties to the old money circles that resented her presence. She spent months studying, learning the ins and outs of business, finance, and investment. She devoured every book, attended every meeting, and surrounded herself with people who actually wanted her to succeed. Then she did something no one expected. She walked into the boardroom of Astor Industries, the billion-dollar company she had inherited, and took control. The executives, most of whom had been loyal to Richard and the Astor family, expected her to fail. They thought she'd be intimidated by the numbers, by the suits, by the cold, ruthless world of high finance. They expected her to step aside, to let them handle everything while she quietly collected her checks in the background. They were wrong. Maya fired half the board within the first month. She hired new talent, bringing in young, diverse minds who had been shut out of the corporate world for years. She overhauled the company's investment strategies, shifting billions into affordable housing projects, educational programs, and tech startups led by women and minorities. She didn't just inherit wealth. She weaponized it against the very system that had tried to keep her down. And people noticed. She went from being a laughingstock in billionaire circles to one of the most powerful women in finance. Reporters who had once mocked her were now forced to acknowledge her brilliance. Maya Carter is redefining what it means to be a billionaire, read one headline. The waitress who became a Wall Street powerhouse, said another. But success didn't erase danger. The more power she gained, the more enemies she made. One night, as she was leaving an investor's dinner in Manhattan, her security team spotted a black SUV trailing her car. Another time, a masked intruder tried to break into her penthouse, but was caught by her security before he could get inside. Death threats flooded her inbox. Anonymous messages warned her to sell the company and disappear. Richard, though publicly silent, was still pulling strings behind the scenes, using his connections to sabotage her business deals and smear her name wherever he could. Maya knew she wasn't safe, but she also knew she couldn't afford to back down. She decided to hit back, not with lawyers, not with press conferences, but with power. She personally launched investigations into Richard's financial dealings, uncovering years of embezzlement, tax fraud, and backdoor deals that could ruin him. She exposed his connections to corrupt politicians, leaked evidence of illegal business practices, and made sure that every major news outlet in the country had a front-page story about the fraudulent dealings of the real Astor heir. Within months, Richard was arrested for financial crimes. His assets were seized, his reputation shattered. Maya didn't just win. She obliterated her enemies. By the end of the year, Maya Carter was no longer just a waitress who inherited billions. She was a billionaire in her own right, a woman who had fought tooth and nail to hold on to the power that had been given to her. When she sat at the head of the boardroom table, looking out at the executives who had once dismissed her, she smiled. "Get comfortable," she told them. "I'm not going anywhere." The world had tried to erase her. Instead, she had rewritten the rules.